You know, when it comes to the climate, it's tough to separate the signal from the noise. I've seriously thought about, so many people say, I'm not a scientist, but that I've actually thought of creating a segment called I'm Not a Scientist, but here is one. So joining us for this segment, we're going to be talking about one area where confusion has been sown in the climate debate. We'll be talking to both a scientist and someone who's an expert in the communication and miscommunication of climate issues. We're going to be talking specifically about an individual named Wei-Huk Soon, also known as Willie Soon. Some articles were written about him recently, and now there is a wave of a defense being mounted on his behalf. Joining us is Peter Sinclair. Peter has been on, both our guests have been on the program before. Peter is a filmmaker and a blogger on climate crock issues. And also joining us is Dr. John P. Abraham, who is, in fact, a climate scientist. So, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us.
Great pleasure to be on.
Well, it's great to have both of you because, you know, this is both individually, both jointly and severally, as the lawyers say, because this is an issue that straddles both media and science, and in this case, it seems to me sometimes that what the opponents of taking climate action do is throw up a smokescreen, a sort of pollutant cloud, if you will, of misinformation. And recently there were a couple articles about Willie Soon, pointing out that although he's often described as a Harvard astrophysicist, he is neither, as I understand it, a Harvard employee nor an astrophysicist, and he has been floating ideas about science and climate change that are highly questionable. So I wanted to take those both on from both your perspectives. Maybe we'll start with Peter on the communication side. There were a couple, I thought, very well-researched arguments on the misstatement of Soon's credentials and so on. Before we even get into the merits of what he has to say, I am now looking at something on Breitbart.com, the right-wing site, entitled The Crucifixion of Dr. Wei-Huk Soon, which refers to him in the first sentence. In recent weeks, Dr. Wei-Huk Soon, a distinguished solar astrophysicist. That's how it begins. What's going on here? Who's behind this? Peter?
Well, first, page one, Dr. Soon is not a solar astrophysicist. He has a PhD in aerospace engineering. He is not associated with Harvard, although he constantly puts that in his resume as if he was. And he basically is a guy that goes out and raises money. He hits up big right-wing foundations, individuals, and corporations with offering to produce what he calls deliverables, which are scientific or pseudoscientific papers that he shops to various outlets and presents himself on venues like Fox News and various right-wing conferences as a scientist, and then merely goes ahead and repeats really kind of embarrassingly inaccurate and just poor scientific reasoning, and that's how he's made his living.
Okay, so let's
$1.25 million for the last 10 years or so.
Well, okay, nice work if you can get it, as they say. But let's pivot for a second. Dr. Abraham, when we talk about, someone like Dr. Soon, who is, we'll get to the merit of his ideas in a second, but you, for example, are a professor of thermal and fluid sciences. You've studied thermodynamics, heat transfer, fluid flow, numerical simulation, energy, all of which sounds very climate related to me. Now, aerospace engineering is a noble and interesting field, but is that qualification really to talk about climate science?
Well, that's a hard thing to answer because his formal training in aerospace engineering or aeronautical engineering may not have provided the background to study climate science, but of course people can learn new things and they can change. But rather than look at his formal degree, what we like to look at are the outcomes of his research. And some of the things about Willie Soon, I mean, you mentioned this story that he was a reputable scientist in climate science, but in fact, if you talk to people in the field who look at his work, they look at the quality of his work, they find it sorely lacking. And the groups, the anti-science groups that want to postpone or delay action on climate change, they look everywhere around the world to get someone with any credentials to stand up and say climate change isn't happening or there's a natural occurrence. And the reason why they have to look so hard is the vast majority of scientists are in agreement because the evidence is so clearly painted in the data. And once in a while they can find someone with second-rate credentials and they can put them up as an expert and you know, I feel bad for them because there's so few people that they can select from, but in the end, when you have someone of Willie Soon's background and you look at the quality of their work and you see that their work hasn't withstood scrutiny, in fact, it's been found severely faulted, you see that they just don't have many experts that they can go to. So that's really how a scientist practicing in this field looks at Willie Soon and his work.
Well, I want to go back to the funding in a second, but let me first of all, Professor Abraham, I admire your generosity of spirit. I appreciate it. I try to emulate that sort of thing. But the summary that I get is that this is a guy who, while well trained in another field, is not trained in this field. As you say, people can learn I could learn it too, I suppose, and do valid research if I worked hard enough and long enough. But you have the combination of the lack of credentials in this field and research that seems to first of all vary with what people normally find, and seems to be wildly off the mark and perhaps has methodological problems. Is that
well? You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, you can find fault with someone because they're writing about a topic they have no formal training in. But what I like to do is I like to say, okay, well, let's see what information they have and what ideas they're proposing, and let's see if they have merit. I don't really care if he's trained in philosophy or astrophysics or history. What I want to know is he right? And when you look at the history of his work, his work has been very, very low quality. Other scientists don't take him credibly because of the low quality of his work. So I like to look at the merits of the published work on its own, and it just doesn't have much merit. And for me, it's a full stop there. But if we want to summarize the situation with Willie Soon, as Peter pointed out, he's taken about $1.25 million of research funding from fossil fuel companies. His papers in the documents that were released, his papers were described as deliverables to the funding organization. He failed to disclose his funding in his journal papers. I mean, you're required to disclose where you got your money from, and I think in 8 or 11 papers he forgot to do that. And he didn't disclose funding for his work preparing for congressional testimony. His science has been found faulty, as I've said before, and finally, he is currently being investigated by his employer. So the situation for Willie Soon is looking pretty dire if you evaluate it today.
On the other hand, Peter, it seems that the strategy of the polluting crowd, for lack of a better terminology, the strategies, everything Dr. Abraham says makes absolute impeccable sense. And yet the strategy seems to be to create a toxic cloud of confusion around this issue. I'm looking at all these New York Times, Greenpeace smear, warming skeptic Dr. Soon, the smearing of Willie Soon, the crucifixion of Dr. Soon. All this seems to be among the believers to create a martyr, and then among the rest of much of the rest of the country, create enough confusion that people just walk away shrugging their shoulders, saying, "I don't know." Is that kind of the end game here, you think, from a communication point of view?
Well, this isn't the first time Dr. Soon has been held up as being persecuted. A number of years ago, a paper of his got published, kind of pushed through by an overzealous editor, and the paper was of such low quality that half the editorial board of the journal resigned rather than be associated with Dr. Soon and his work. And this, of course, this very poor science, it was kind of talked about in the scientific community, and then this this was portrayed in the climate denial, usual climate denial vectors as Dr. Soon being persecuted for his ideas. He's not being persecuted for his ideas. He's being recognized as someone who does bad science, and so there's a big difference there. But that's how the climate denial machine works. It's all based on this sort of a conspiracy theory that somehow the 97% of scientists who understand that global warming is human caused are all in collusion in some kind of a global plot, and that they're persecuting truth tellers, supposedly like Dr. Soon. That's the narrative that they want to put out.
And Dr. Abraham, to that theory that climate change is a conspiracy being foisted by the climate science community on the planet, it must be pretty hard work to falsify the results of all those computer simulations and atmospheric measurements, isn't it?
No, it's not hard at all, because all you have to say is that most of the scientists are lying. I mean, it's actually a perfect situation for Willie Soon and folks like him, because they can say that they're being persecuted because they're telling truth to power, or they are the Galileo that shows that everyone else is wrong or everyone else is in on the money. And in fact, what we often hear is that scientists are making this climate change thing up because they want their grant money. And we have here a reversal of fortune, that now we find out that it's the climate deniers that have been in for the money for a long time. But I mean, it's a perfect narrative for their audience. It's the liberal media making this up and persecuting us even though we're right. And the more you persecute them, as they like to think of it, the more they're right and the more they galvanize their base. But going back to this, I mean, in the end, as a scientist, I don't really care. I don't care that much about who paid him for his work. What I want to know is, was he right? And time after time after time, he's been shown to be wrong. And it just goes to show that when you want to find someone who has any credentials at all, who can show that climate change isn't happening, you have to look far and wide, and you have to come up with second or third-rate scientists like Willie Soon.
Now, and I know, I appreciate, Professor John Abraham, that you're trying to, that you want to avoid anything that could be construed as an ad hominem attack. But objectively speaking, to fail to disclose your funding sources in a number of papers and in congressional testimony, isn't that considered, in general terms, a fairly serious ethical lapse?
Well, most journals have funding disclosure requirements, and they ask that you disclose funding. And, maybe he forgot once, or maybe he forgot twice, or maybe there were multiple authors on a paper and they thought it was each other's responsibility. You can understand if it happens once or twice, but to happen either 8 or 11 times in the last few years, as reported by the Greenpeace documents, is a pretty telling tale. And again, if his science was good, we wouldn't make that much of a deal of it, but his science has been bad, and he's failed to disclose his funding information. And when he, as I understand it from the reporting I've read, he helped prepare documents for congressional testimony, and he was paid for that time. It's, we're the taxpayers, and we hire Congress to make good decisions. And they should know if there is a conflict of interest when people come to testify to them. They should know who is paying for the testimony or testimony preparation, because it allows them to view the information they get in the context of that funding. It's just kind of common sense. I mean, it is certainly an ethical lapse, and in fact, that's likely why his institution is investigating him. Journals do have these reporting standards. So, it'll be interesting to see how this all shakes out, but it's not looking very good.
Well, okay, good. No, I appreciate that, and I would connect a third dot, which is the ethical lapse, failing to disclose, and it just coincidentally his conclusions, which seem very out of the norm, conform with those financial contributions he failed to disclose. Peter Sinclair, I guess in closing, what can we do on the communications side, those of us who are in that side of the biz, what can we do to kind of push back against this cloud of confusion they're creating?
Well, the good news is that if you compare this to 5 years ago when emails were stolen from a climate research center and then distributed, cherry-picked quotes were distributed to the media. The media was caught just flat-footed and handled that very poorly, and basically repeated faithfully the denial talking points that were being spread. This time, what we're seeing is a media that is going after the climate denialists, investigating their research and their funding. And I think you're going to see this conversation broaden in the coming weeks, because we're going to see a major Hollywood movie come out called Merchants of Doubt, which is going to show how this whole anti-science template, this way of arguing, was developed by the tobacco industry and adopted by the climate denial industry. In fact, some of the very same people who were involved in tobacco denial have now graduated into climate denial, and it is a means of distorting the public conversation, and I think we're all going to start to understand it much better in the coming months.
Well, I will say this. I think that those of us who follow your work and that of Professor John Abraham are very grateful for the work you do in trying to dispel the uncertainty and bring truth to it. Peter, we can find your work, we can find your blog at, I believe it is climatecrocs.org. Is that correct?
.com. Yeah,
.com.
Climate Denial Crock of the Week is the name of the series.
Climate Denial Crock of the Week. I'm sure there are weeks when you need 3 or 4 of those. And Professor John P. Abraham, thanks so much for joining us and for your good work in this area as well.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks much.
And all of you folks out there, please keep fighting on this issue as if the fate of the planet depends on it, because it does. We will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.